The hotel guests at the Palmer House in Chicago barely noticed the quiet janitor who cleaned their rooms each morning. Robert Martinez moved through the luxury suites with the invisible efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of not being seen. At 58, he seemed like just another working-class man putting in his hours until retirement. What they didn't know was that the man emptying their trash cans had once stood between presidents and bullets, that his calm demeanor came from 25 years of Secret Service training, and that when two professional assassins checked into the hotel that Tuesday evening, they had unknowingly chosen the one place in Chicago where their target would be protected by someone who'd spent a lifetime stopping people exactly like that. I wonder where you're watching this story from today. Maybe you're in a busy hotel somewhere, or perhaps at home thinking about the invisible workers who keep our world running smoothly. Most of the time we walk past custodians, janitors, and maintenance workers without giving them a second thought. But sometimes, just sometimes, that quiet person pushing a cleaning cart carries a history that could save your life. This is one of those stories, and it takes place in the shadows of power, where the most dangerous people in the world learned that you should never ever underestimate the help. Robert Martinez began each day at 4:30 a.m., arriving at Chicago's historic Palmer House through the service entrance on Wabash Avenue. For 3 years, he'd followed the same routine: clock in, collect his cleaning supplies, and disappear into the maze of luxury suites and conference rooms that made up one of America's most prestigious hotels. At 58, Robert moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned that hurrying attracted attention, and attention was the enemy of invisibility. His gray maintenance uniform was always clean, but never crisp. His work boots were comfortable but never new, and his demeanor was professional but never memorable. To the guests who encountered him, he was part of the background, as essential and unnoticed as the marble columns in the lobby. The Palmer House attracted a specific clientele: foreign diplomats attending conferences at the nearby consulates, business executives conducting high-stakes negotiations, and politicians holding meetings that didn't appear on any official schedule. It was exactly the kind of environment where Robert could blend into the shadows while staying close to the world he'd once been part of. His supervisor, Maria Santos, appreciated Robert's reliability and discretion. "He's the best worker we've ever had," she told the hotel's general manager during Robert's annual review. "Never late, never complains, and the guests love him. Half of them request him specifically for their rooms." What Maria didn't understand was that Robert's popularity with VIP guests wasn't about his cleaning skills. It was about the unconscious confidence he projected, the sense that nothing bad could happen when he was around. Powerful people, even when they didn't recognize it consciously, could sense the presence of a professional protector. Robert's path to hotel housekeeping had been neither straight nor voluntary. He'd joined the United States Secret Service at 23, fresh out of the University of Illinois, with a degree in criminal justice and a burning desire to serve his country at the highest levels. His first assignment had been to the Chicago field office, investigating financial crimes and providing security for visiting dignitaries. But Robert's combination of physical presence, tactical intelligence, and unflappable demeanor quickly marked him for more specialized work. For 25 years, Robert Martinez had been one of the elite agents assigned to presidential protection details. He traveled the world with 3 different presidents, had stood in the background during summit meetings that shaped international policy, and had been present for moments of history that most people only read about in newspapers. His service record included commendations from the president himself, specialized training in counter-assault techniques, and certifications in threat assessment that made him one of the most qualified protection professionals in federal service. Robert had faced down would-be assassins, had coordinated security for events with tens of thousands of attendees, and had made split-second decisions that had prevented international incidents. But federal service had come at a cost that Robert hadn't fully understood until it was too late. The incident that ended Robert's Secret Service career had occurred during a presidential visit to Colombia 3 years ago. Intelligence had indicated a credible assassination threat from a cartel-funded terrorist organization, but the visit was too important diplomatically to cancel. Robert had been part of the advance team responsible for securing the venue where the president would deliver a major speech on drug policy. Everything had been planned with the obsessive attention to detail that characterized Secret Service operations, multiple security perimeters, counter-sniper teams, and enough backup protocols to handle any conceivable threat. The attack had come not from the direction anyone expected, but from within the secured perimeter itself. A local police officer who'd been trusted with interior security had been compromised by the cartel and was attempting to position himself for a close-range assassination attempt during the president's speech. Robert had been the first to recognize the threat. Something about the officer's positioning and behavior had triggered the instincts developed over decades of protection work. He'd had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would either save the president's life or end his own career. Robert had made the right tactical choice, stopping the threat before it could materialize. But the split-second decision had required him to neutralize the compromised officer with lethal force, in full view of international media. During a speech about peace and cooperation, the president had been saved. The diplomatic mission had been completed successfully, but Robert's action had created an international incident that required months of diplomatic damage control, and had resulted in his reassignment to administrative duties that essentially ended his protection career. The transition from protecting the most powerful people in the world to cleaning hotel rooms hadn't been immediate. Robert had spent 18 months in counseling, dealing with the psychological aftermath of an incident that had saved lives but destroyed his sense of purpose. Federal retirement benefits were generous, but Robert had discovered that retirement at 55 wasn't a peaceful transition he'd expected. He'd spent his entire adult life in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats and preparing for emergencies that might never come. Civilian life felt simultaneously boring and terrifying. Hotel work had been a compromise solution suggested by his therapist. It would keep him around the kind of high-security environment he understood, but in a role that required no life-or-death decision. He could use his observational skills and his understanding of VIP protection needs, but as a service provider rather than a guardian. The Palmer House had been perfect. It attracted exactly the kind of clientele Robert was trained to protect, but his role was to clean their rooms rather than save their lives. It was close enough to his old world to feel familiar but different enough to feel safe. What Robert's colleagues at the Palmer House didn't understand was that his cleaning work was informed by 25 years of the most sophisticated security training in the world. When he cleaned a VIP suite, he wasn't just removing trash and changing linens, he was conducting a security assessment. He noted the items guests left visible, the documents they failed to secure, and the personal habits that could make them vulnerable to threats. He observed who visited which rooms, who made phone calls in languages they thought no one else understood, and who exhibited the behavior patterns that might indicate hostile intent. Robert's cleaning cart contained the usual supplies, but also items that most janitors wouldn't carry: a small mirror for checking around corners, a compact flashlight for examining dark spaces, and a discreet camera for documenting anything that seemed out of place. Not because he was planning to use the information, but because old habits died hard. Most importantly, Robert had positioned himself to be a quiet guardian for guests who had no idea they were being protected. When the Saudi trade minister's son had gotten drunk and wandered into the wrong part of the hotel at 2 a.m., Robert had been there to guide him safely back to his room. When the German diplomat's wife had been followed by suspicious individuals during her shopping trip, Robert had discreetly alerted hotel security. When the Japanese businessman had left classified documents in the hotel restaurant, Robert had secured them before anyone else could access them. He'd been doing the job he'd trained for his entire life, just without the recognition, the authority or the federal backing that had once made him one of the most effective protection agents in the world. Tuesday, October 10th, 3:47 p.m. Ambassador Elena Vasquez checked into the Palmer House presidential suite, with the kind of security detail that immediately got Robert's attention. The Spanish diplomat was in Chicago for sensitive trade negotiations that had been making headlines for weeks, and her presence at the hotel represented exactly the kind of high-value target that Robert's instincts told him to monitor carefully. Robert was cleaning the 45th floor when the ambassador's entourage arrived. 6 Spanish security officers, 2 State Department agents, and a coordination team from the Chicago Police Department's Dignitary Protection Unit. It was the kind of security presence that suggested either serious threats or serious paranoia. From his position behind his cleaning cart, Robert observed the security sweep with professional interest. The Spanish agents were competent but predictable, following European protection protocols that Robert recognized from his international training. The State Department agents were thorough but bureaucratic, more concerned with paperwork than with actual threat assessment. The Chicago police were capable but out of their depth with this level of international security. What concerned Robert was what he didn't see: proper counter-surveillance measures, adequate perimeter security, and the kind of unpredictable security patterns that made assassination attempts difficult to plan. Ambassador Vasquez herself was a study in controlled elegance. At 52, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to moving in dangerous diplomatic circles. But Robert could see the signs of stress that indicated she was aware of specific threats against her. As the security team conducted their sweep of the presidential suite, Robert made a mental note of their procedures and protocols. Old habits from 25 years of protection work made it impossible for him to ignore security vulnerabilities, even when they weren't his responsibility to address. Robert's concern deepened when he noticed two guests who had checked in within hours of the ambassador's arrival. Professional experience had taught him to recognize certain patterns of behavior that indicated hostile surveillance, and both of these individuals exhibited signs that triggered his threat assessment instincts. The first was a man in his 40s who had registered under the name David Coleman and claimed to be a software consultant from Denver. But Coleman's luggage was wrong for a business traveler. His documentation felt rehearsed rather than natural, and his behavior patterns suggested someone conducting surveillance rather than conducting business. More concerning was Coleman's room selection. He'd specifically requested a suite on the 46th floor, one floor above the ambassador's security perimeter, with a clear line of sight to the windows of the presidential suite. It was exactly the kind of positioning that a professional would choose for either surveillance or direct action. The second suspicious guest was a woman calling herself Jennifer Walsh, who claimed to be a freelance journalist covering the trade negotiations. But Walsh's credentials didn't hold up to the kind of scrutiny that Robert automatically applied to anyone in proximity to a protected principal. Her press identification was legitimate but recent. Her knowledge of the trade negotiations was suspiciously detailed, and her equipment was more sophisticated than most freelancers could afford. Most troubling was Walsh's behavior during the security sweep. While most guests were either curious or annoyed by the disruption, Walsh had observed the entire process with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence for operational planning. Robert's 25 years of experience had taught him to recognize the difference between curious guests, aggressive paparazzi, and actual threats. Coleman and Walsh exhibited behavior patterns that suggested professional training in surveillance and target assessment. During his evening cleaning rounds, Robert discreetly documented their activities. Coleman had made 3 phone calls in a language that Robert identified as Czech, using terminology that suggested military or intelligence background. Walsh had been photographing the hotel's layout and security positions with equipment that far exceeded the needs of trade negotiation coverage. Most concerning was their coordination. At 9:23 p.m., Robert observed both individuals conducting what appeared to be a synchronized reconnaissance of the ambassador's security perimeter. They moved independently but with timing that suggested communication and shared objective. Robert faced a dilemma that was both familiar and completely different from his Secret Service days. He recognized a probable threat developing against a protected principal, but he had no authority to intervene, no backup to call, and no protocols to follow beyond his own judgment. Using skills developed during decades of federal service, Robert began conducting his own intelligence operation. During his late-night cleaning shifts, when the hotel was quiet and security was minimal, he accessed areas that allowed him to observe Coleman and Walsh without detection. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Coleman's room contained equipment that was clearly designed for more than software consulting: high-powered optics, communication devices, and tactical gear that suggested preparation for a direct action operation. Walsh's room contained detailed plans of the hotel's layout, photographs of the ambassador's security team, and documentation that indicated extensive pre-operational planning. Most troubling was evidence that both individuals had been conducting surveillance of the ambassador for at least a week before her arrival in Chicago. They knew her schedule, her security protocols, and her personal habits in ways that suggested either inside information or sophisticated intelligence gathering capability. Robert recognized the pattern from his Secret Service training. This was a professional assassination operation in the final stages of preparation. Coleman and Walsh weren't journalists or business travelers. They were killers who had been planning the ambassador's death with the kind of precision that made amateur attempts look like pranks. At 2:17 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Robert made a decision that would determine whether Ambassador Vasquez lived to see Thursday. He could contact the State Department, alert the Spanish security team, or notify the Chicago police about his suspicions. But all of those options would require him to explain how a hotel janitor had gathered intelligence on suspected assassins. And Robert wasn't ready to reveal his background to officials who might not believe him or might not act quickly enough. Instead, Robert decided to use the skills that had made him one of the most effective protection agents in Secret Service history. He would handle the threat himself, using methods that wouldn't require explanations, justifications, or federal authorization. The assassins had made one critical mistake in their planning. They had assumed that the only security threats they needed to worry about were the ones wearing badges and carrying official identification. They had no way of knowing that the quiet janitor with the cleaning cart was more qualified to stop them than anyone else in the building. Wednesday, October 11th, 6:23 a.m. The assassination attempt began exactly as Robert had predicted, with the kind of precision that confirmed his assessment of Coleman and Walsh as professional killers. At 6:23 a.m., when the ambassador's official security detail was conducting shift change procedures, both assassins moved into position for what should have been a perfectly coordinated attack. Robert was cleaning the 47th floor when he observed Coleman emerging from the stairwell with a case that definitely didn't contain software consulting materials. The man moved with the focused intensity of someone executing a plan that had been rehearsed multiple times, heading toward a position that would give him a clear shot at the ambassador's suite. Simultaneously, Walsh appeared in the hallway one floor below, carrying equipment that Robert immediately recognized as electronic surveillance and communication gear. Her role was clearly to coordinate the attack and ensure that Coleman had real-time intelligence about the ambassador's location and the security team's positions. What the assassins didn't know was that their target wasn't unprotected. Robert Martinez had been watching them for 18 hours, had analyzed their operational plan, and was already moving to intercept them using 25 years of the most sophisticated protection training in the world. Robert's response was a masterclass in single-operator protection techniques that drew on every lesson he'd learned during his Secret Service career. Instead of confronting the assassins directly, which would have put the ambassador at risk and given them time to adapt their plan, Robert began systematically disrupting their operation in ways that would force them to react to his actions rather than execute their own. His first move was to use the hotel's communications system against the assassins. Robert accessed the maintenance frequency that controlled the hotel's elevator system and engineering functions, creating strategic delays and redirections that would separate Coleman and Walsh and force them to operate without their planned coordination. Next, Robert used his detailed knowledge of the hotel's layout to position himself between the assassins and their target. Unlike the official security detail, which was focused on protecting the ambassador's suite, Robert understood that the most effective protection happened before threats reached their intended victims. Most importantly, Robert began using psychological tactics to destabilize the assassin's confidence and timing. He activated fire safety systems that created confusion without triggering full evacuation, used the hotel's PA system to broadcast maintenance announcements that masked his movements, and created the kind of controlled chaos that would make precision shooting nearly impossible. Robert's first direct confrontation was with Walsh, who was attempting to establish a communication post in the hotel's business center. Using approach techniques that had been perfected during decades of federal service, Robert moved up behind her with the silent efficiency that had once made him one of the most effective agents in presidential protection. "Excuse me, ma'am," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from 25 years of dealing with dangerous people. "I need to ask you about some equipment you're using in our business center." Walsh's response was exactly what Robert expected from a professional assassin who had been compromised. Immediate assessment of the threat, rapid calculation of options, and preparation for whatever action would provide the best chance of mission completion. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Walsh replied, her hand moving toward the communication device that would alert Coleman to the problem. "Someone who knows that you're not here to cover trade negotiations," Robert said, positioning himself to block her access to both the communication equipment and the exit. "Someone who's been watching you since you checked in yesterday." Walsh realized immediately that her operation had been blown by someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Her response was swift and professional. She attempted to disable Robert with techniques that suggested military or intelligence training. But Robert had spent 25 years dealing with people who wanted to harm protected principles, and his response was instinctive and overwhelming. Within 30 seconds, Walsh was unconscious and secured. Her communication equipment was disabled, and Robert had confirmed that Coleman was now operating without coordination or backup. With Walsh neutralized, Robert turned his attention to Coleman, who was still positioning himself for a shot at the ambassador. But the loss of communication with his partner had already begun to affect Coleman's confidence and timing, exactly as Robert had intended. Using tactics developed during protection operations in hostile environments, Robert began hunting Coleman through the hotel's corridors and service areas. This wasn't a gunfight or a chase scene. It was a methodical operation designed to isolate and neutralize a threat with minimal risk to innocent guests. Robert's advantage was his intimate knowledge of the hotel's layout and his understanding of how professional assassins operated under pressure. Coleman was skilled and dangerous, but he was also operating in an environment that Robert controlled and using tactics that Robert had been trained to counter. The psychological pressure was immediate and devastating. Coleman found himself dealing with security systems that seemed to malfunction at exactly the wrong moments, elevators that stopped on unexpected floors, and communication equipment that had gone mysteriously silent. His carefully planned assassination was becoming a nightmare of technical failures and operational complications. More importantly, Coleman began to realize that someone was actively hunting him, someone who understood his methods and was systematically destroying his ability to complete the mission. At 7:45 a.m., Robert cornered Coleman in the hotel's service corridor, 3 floors above the ambassador's suite, and completely cut off from escape routes. Coleman was carrying a high-powered rifle that could have easily eliminated the ambassador from his planned position, but against a trained protection agent in close quarters, the weapon was more liability than advantage. United States Secret Service, Robert announced, using the authority that he technically no longer possessed, but which came automatically after 25 years of federal service. Drop your weapon and assume the surrender position. Coleman's response revealed both his professionalism and his desperation. He was facing someone who had identified him as a threat, compromised his operation, and cornered him with techniques that suggested federal law enforcement training. But he was also committed to a mission that was worth more than his life. The standoff lasted exactly 45 seconds, and ended when Coleman made the mistake of assuming that a hotel janitor, regardless of his apparent training, wouldn't be prepared for the kind of lethal force that the situation required. He was wrong. Robert's response was instant, precise, and final. 25 years of protecting presidents and foreign dignitaries had taught him exactly how to handle armed threats in close quarters, and his actions were textbook Secret Service. The FBI response team that arrived at the Palmer House found Coleman unconscious and secured, Walsh in federal custody, and enough evidence to link both assassins to an international terrorism organization that had been targeting Spanish diplomats across Europe. Ambassador Vasquez completed her trade negotiations successfully, never knowing how close she had come to becoming another victim of international terrorism. The Spanish security team received commendations for their excellent coordination with federal authorities in preventing the assassination attempt. And Robert Martinez returned to his cleaning cart, his morning rounds and his carefully maintained invisibility, having once again done the job he'd been trained for his entire life. The FBI's investigation into the assassination attempt revealed the scope of what Robert had prevented. Coleman and Walsh were part of a sophisticated international assassination network that had been responsible for the deaths of 12 diplomats and trade officials across 6 countries over the past 3 years. Their operation at the Palmer House had been planned for 8 months and represented one of the most carefully coordinated assassination attempts ever documented on American soil. If successful, it would have derailed critical trade negotiations and potentially triggered an international crisis that could have affected global economic stability. Special Agent Patricia Wilson, who led the FBI's investigation, was particularly interested in understanding how the assassination attempt had been detected and prevented with such precision. Someone with extensive federal training and intimate knowledge of protection protocols systematically dismantled a professional assassination operation, she noted in her report. The techniques used to neutralize both assassins suggest Secret Service-level expertise. The problem was that none of the official security personnel at the hotel, the Spanish agents, the State Department team, or the Chicago police had been aware of the threat until after it had been eliminated. Hotel security footage showed a maintenance worker who had been present during key moments of the operation, but his identity wasn't immediately clear from the recordings. The individual had moved through the hotel with obvious knowledge of both the layout and the security procedures, had accessed areas that required specialized knowledge, and had demonstrated tactical capabilities that were far beyond normal housekeeping duties. When FBI agents interviewed hotel staff about the maintenance worker, they received a consistent description: quiet, professional, and strangely comforting to have around during high-security events. "He's the best employee we've ever had," Maria Santos told the investigators. "Martinez has been here for 3 years, and he's absolutely reliable. The VIP guests always request him specifically." Agent Wilson's background check on Robert Martinez revealed some interesting discrepancy. His employment application listed previous work in federal security, but provided no details. His references were all from government sources that required security clearances to contact. Most intriguingly, his Social Security records showed a 25-year gap between his documented federal service and his current employment at the Palmer House. 3 days after the assassination attempt, Agent Wilson visited the Palmer House to interview the hotel employee who had apparently single-handedly prevented an international terrorism incident. She found Robert in the service corridor on the 43rd floor, methodically cleaning guest rooms with the same invisible efficiency that had allowed him to stop professional killers. "Mr. Martinez," Agent Wilson said, showing her federal identification, "I'm Special Agent Wilson with the FBI. I need to speak with you about the events that occurred here on Wednesday morning." Robert's response was exactly what Wilson expected from someone with federal training: calm assessment, professional courtesy, and careful consideration of how much information to reveal. "I'm happy to help with your investigation, Agent Wilson," Robert replied, "but I'm not sure what information a hotel maintenance worker could provide about federal matters." Wilson smiled. She'd been a federal agent long enough to recognize when she was talking to a colleague, regardless of what uniform he was wearing. "Mr. Martinez, we both know that you're not just a hotel maintenance worker. The question is whether you're going to tell me who you really are, or whether I'm going to have to figure it out through federal databases." The conversation that followed took place in a secure conference room that the Palmer House provided for federal investigations. Robert had to make a decision about whether to maintain his carefully constructed anonymity or trust a federal agent with the truth about his background and his actions. Agent Wilson's approach was direct but respectful. "Mr. Martinez, yesterday's operation required the kind of training and expertise that only comes from federal service at the highest levels. I've read the preliminary reports, and whoever stopped that assassination attempt knew exactly what they were doing." Robert considered his options carefully. He'd spent 3 years building a quiet life away from federal service, but the events at the Palmer House had proven that he couldn't completely escape his training or his sense of responsibility. 25 years, United States Secret Service, Robert said finally. "Presidential Protection Detail, Counter-Assault Teams, International Dignitary Security. I retired 3 years ago, and took this job because I wanted something quiet." Wilson nodded. She'd suspected as much from the evidence, but hearing it confirmed explained everything about how a professional assassination attempt had been stopped by a hotel janitor. "Mr. Martinez, what you did here was extraordinary. You identified a threat that none of the official security personnel detected. You neutralized 2 professional assassins without endangering any innocent people, and you prevented what could have been an international incident. Why didn't you contact federal authorities?" Robert's answer revealed the complexity of his situation and his motivations. "Agent Wilson, I've been out of federal service for 3 years. I had no official authority, no backup, and no way to prove that my threat assessment was accurate. If I'd been wrong, I would have been just another hotel employee making wild accusations about guests. If I'd been right but waited for official response, the ambassador would have been dead before backup arrived." Agent Wilson's report to FBI headquarters described Robert's actions as one of the most professionally executed single-operator protection missions in federal law enforcement history. She recommended that Robert be offered immediate reinstatement to federal service with full honors and a promotion to supervisory level. The Secret Service response was swift and decisive. Assistant Director Michael Torres visited Chicago personally to meet with Robert and discuss his future with the agency. "Robert, what you did at the Palmer House reminded everyone why you were one of our best agents," Torres said during their meeting. "We want you back, full reinstatement, choice of assignment, and a supervisory position that will let you train the next generation of protection agents." Robert's response surprised Torres as much as it had surprised Agent Wilson. "Mike, I appreciate the offer, but I like what I'm doing here. I like protecting people without them knowing they're being protected. I like being able to help without having to fill out paperwork or justify my actions to a bureaucracy." What Robert didn't explain to Torres was that his experience at the Palmer House had taught him something important about the nature of protection and service. For 25 years he'd protected presidents and foreign dignitaries because it was his job, his duty, and his responsibility as a federal agent. But protecting Ambassador Vasquez had been different. He'd done it not because of federal orders or official duties, but because it was the right thing to do. He'd used his skills to protect someone who had no idea she was being protected, and that felt more meaningful than anything he'd done during his official federal career. The assassination attempt had also proven to Robert that his transition from federal service to civilian work hadn't been a step down. It had been a step toward using his abilities in ways that felt more personally satisfying. The Palmer House's corporate management had a different reaction to learning about Robert's background. They offered him a promotion to Director of Security, a position that would have utilized his federal experience and provided him with the authority to implement the kind of protection protocols that would make the hotel one of the safest facilities in Chicago. Robert declined that offer as well. "I don't want to be in charge of security," he explained to the hotel's general manager. "I want to provide security. There's a difference between managing protection and actually protecting people." His decision puzzled executives who couldn't understand why someone with his qualifications would choose to remain in a housekeeping position. But Robert had learned that job satisfaction didn't come from title, authority, or recognition. It came from the alignment between his abilities and his values. 6 months after the assassination attempt, Robert Martinez was still working housekeeping at the Palmer House, still moving through the luxury suites with invisible efficiency, and still protecting VIP guests who had no idea they were safer because of his presence. The hotel had implemented new security protocols based on Robert's recommendations, but his official role remained unchanged. To most guests, he was still just the quiet janitor who cleaned their rooms and somehow made them feel safer without them understanding why. Ambassador Vasquez returned to the Palmer House twice more during her diplomatic mission, and each time she requested that the maintenance worker who was so professional during my last stay be assigned to her floor. She never learned his name or his background, but she sensed the same thing that all of Robert's VIP guests sensed, that nothing bad could happen when he was around. The Spanish security team, the State Department agents, and the Chicago police all received recognition for their role in preventing the assassination attempt. Robert's name appeared nowhere in the official reports, which was exactly how he preferred it. During a rare interview with a federal law enforcement magazine that was studying the Palmer House case, Robert articulated the philosophy that had guided his transition from federal service to hotel work. Protection isn't about badges or authority or official recognition. It's about being present when people need you, being prepared for threats they can't see, and being willing to act when action is required. He paused before continuing. "I spent 25 years protecting people because it was my job. Now I protect people because it's who I am. The difference is that now I do it by choice, not by assignment." The interviewer asked if he missed the prestige and recognition of federal service. "I miss working with talented colleagues, and I miss having federal resources at my disposal," Robert replied. "But I don't miss the bureaucracy, the politics, or the pressure to justify every decision to people who've never faced the situations they're asking you to explain." As he finished his shift that evening, Robert reflected on the path that had brought him from presidential protection to hotel housekeeping. It wasn't the career trajectory that anyone at the Secret Service Academy would have predicted, but it was the one that had given him the most personal satisfaction. The VIP guests sleeping safely in their luxury suites had no idea that the quiet man who cleaned their rooms had once stood between presidents and bullets. They just knew that they felt safer when he was around. And that was exactly how Robert wanted it. 2 years after the Palmer House incident, Robert Martinez remained at his post, still walking the luxury corridors with the same professional attention that had enabled him to detect and defeat an international assassination plot. The hotel had become his community. The VIP guests had become his extended family, and the work had become exactly what he'd hoped it would be when he left federal service. The assassination network that Coleman and Walsh had been part of was dismantled through international cooperation, leading to arrests across 3 continents and the prevention of at least 6 additional diplomatic murders. The Palmer House case had become a model for how hotel security and federal law enforcement could work together to protect high-value targets. But for Robert, the most important outcome was simpler. The Palmer House remained a place where the world's most important people could conduct their business safely, knowing that someone was watching over them, even when they didn't know they needed protection. On quiet Tuesday mornings, when the hotel was nearly empty except for early arriving VIP guests and their security details, Robert would sometimes pause in the presidential suite and remember the morning when professional assassins had learned that you should never underestimate the help. His radio crackled with a routine message from Maria Santos. "Robert, we have a foreign minister checking into the presidential suite this afternoon. Can you make sure everything is perfect up there?" "Copy that," Robert replied, adjusting his cleaning cart toward a situation that would require patience, attention to detail, and the kind of invisible protection that had nothing to do with official authority. As he walked through the hotel he'd protected and served for over 5 years, Robert Martinez knew he'd found exactly where he belonged. Not because the work was prestigious, but because it was meaningful. Not because it was recognized, but because it mattered. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that nobody knew had been won. Sometimes the greatest service was the kind that prevented problems rather than responding to them. And sometimes the most valuable use of extraordinary skills was protecting ordinary moments when powerful people needed to feel safe. The former Secret Service agent who had become a hotel janitor had learned that heroism wasn't about the badge you wore or the title on your business card. It was about using whatever abilities you possessed to make the world a little safer for the people around you. And every day, as diplomats and world leaders moved safely through the Palmer House, that lesson was proven true. If this story reminded you to notice and appreciate the invisible workers who keep our world running safely, share it with someone who needs to understand that heroes come in all forms. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of extraordinary people choosing to serve quietly in ordinary roles. The janitor cleaning your office building might have protected presidents. The maintenance worker fixing your hotel elevator might have saved lives in ways you'll never know. Sometimes the most remarkable people are the ones who choose to serve without recognition, asking for nothing more than the satisfaction of keeping others safe.